So what we see then is that this constant notion of fitting the mold. Well, fitting the mold is kind of good for those who can, quote unquote, fit the mold, and also for those who have figured out how to fit the mold. But we do know that there are many children and many students who don't fit the mold, who do school, and if they don't do school, they leave school. After that, what stands in the way, the participant responses in terms of the systems issues, what they found out were restrictive time schedules. It is interesting to note that with teachers, when we always talk to teachers, and I did this just 48 hours ago in talking to a large number of teachers in northern Alberta, they said their best learning happened when it's outside the classroom, when they don't feel constrained by a timetable, when they're able to do experiential learning. Curious. And I think in many of our cases here, when we think back to our school, when we were in school, one of the most entertaining and best times, I should say entertaining, but in a learning point of view, the best times was the field trip. You know, we don't remember, you know, some classes, or maybe we do, but in a very negative way, you know, what we were like in some classes as opposed to others. But when we're actively involved, and the timetabling, scheduling, the confining physical spaces, the heavy curriculum demands, the demands by numerous stakeholders, the institutional rigidity, the lack of local autonomy, and the large bureaucracy. These are the elements that have been identified. So in effect, what we're talking about, and what we're talking about here and addressing, is what I would describe as the emancipation of teaching. This is what needs to happen. The OECD just recently, by the way, about a month ago, put out a report, and you might find this very interesting, and if you haven't read the report, I would strongly encourage you to do so. But what they said after some long-term evaluation, they have come to the conclusion that market-driven approaches to improving education have not worked and don't work. So putting schools to compete against each other has actually festered the situation and created a more negative situation, according to the OECD. And what happens is that you create inequality. Good schools get better, poor schools get poorer. And that's the last thing you want, because then that is what we call not fair. And also what we recognize and what the OECD report said is they discovered that the schools that actually then developed high achievement scores stopped sharing. They wouldn't share it with other people. Why? Well, why? The competition was intense and ferocious. So we have to think this through. We have to think about these type of structures and what they actually mean and do to us. The way we think, the mindsets, deep-seated fear of the unknown, of making a mistake, of being judged. And it's interesting because I look at this, and I even say this recently, I have yet to see in a job posting for a senior position in a school board, okay, where it's marked right on the top, risk taker, creative. And so now we have to realize then at that point that if we don't start it from the leadership and we try to support these people who are going to want to do things, and I know people try to do things, but we have to ultimately support them in trying to do this. What's at stake? Our children. And when people say, yes, but if we're going to take risks with children, isn't that a bad thing? No, I think it's a heck of a lot better than doing what sometimes we consider doing very little for children, other than maintaining the status quo, which we all seem to feel is just not good enough anymore. So we have to move that forward. When we look at it in terms of what their mindsets were saying, the fear of failure, of being judged, it's extremely profound. Who wants to be judged in a negative way? But yet, when we look at it, and we know when you go into schools and you see what the teachers are doing, some of them are doing some fantastic things. And why? Because they surpass their fear of being judged or seen negatively. The lack of a growth mindset, the fear of change, the fear of new or unknown, and the desire to maintain status quo. After that, the obstacle was the resources, the issue of the resources. We're not empowering teachers with the right resources to lead, inspire, and teach in the way they would like to teach. Too often we say, well, this is what they need. Well, I have to beg to differ, because I don't think there's anybody here, in this room here, who would like to be told, this is what you're going to need to do a good job. Yes, but these are mine. No, this is what you're going to need. And yet this is something that happens way too often now, and we have to address it. And I'm not trying to pretend, by the way, that I was any better or any worse, okay, than anybody else in this room when I was a director general, or when I was a principal, or when I was a director of human resources. I was the same, and I made the same mistakes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm off the hook. It's not. So when we look at it in terms of the supplementary resources, when we were looking at it in terms of how do we go forward, making sure in terms of the budgetary considerations, the monetary elements, how do we move forward, having the impact, the insufficient resources, the inadequate funding model, funding for change initiatives, and resource support. Now here's something that I do counsel to a lot of school boards, and I counsel to ministries, and I counsel to anyone who's got a direct link into education. There is the issue of declining enrollments, there is the issue of declining resources. But there's nothing that prevents ministries nor school boards, okay, to become entrepreneurial in the sense of trying to find and use the resources they have to actually generate revenues. And in some cases, some school boards are doing this, some more than others. But this is a mindset that we have to start putting into the people who are actually leading our organizations as well, is to tell them that they have that opportunity to go out and do things and maximize the resources and the people they have within it. There's nothing better, and I go back to Dofasco, the steel company. You know, our product is steel, our strength is people. And what a wonderful slogan it was, but in effect it said it all. When we look at the demands of curriculum, curriculum is no longer easily linked to the world that we live in. And as I mentioned this to you as well, this is an ongoing issue in terms of how do we go about ensuring that there's a relevancy to it. And I can assure you that for every teacher that I've always met, if there's one thing that many of them want to be, it's relevant, and relevant to their students. And so when we look at it in terms of this here participant, the lack of the relevant content, the curriculum constraints, the heavy academic focus, the number of expectations, the fragmentation of curriculum. Yesterday in my address at Microsoft, I was talking to a lot of CIOs, and I said to them, it didn't make any sense that you have filters. It doesn't make any sense that you stop children from going onto YouTube. Heaven help you, you wouldn't want to have schools where there's YouTube in it. And yet, I can tell you that when I had to open a pool recently in terms of going back and moving into Montreal, and I couldn't remember how to do it, where did I go? YouTube. So imagine if I had put in the same constraints of a school board into my house, and to say, here's how you're going to use the technology, why use it? So these are the type of things that we have to move beyond. We have to think far, far, far further than this. The social challenges, outside influences like mental health and broken homes are being placed on the shoulders of public education. I can say this as well, coming from Quebec, that this is not new. We've seen this pattern over the last 15 to 20 years in particular. When schools, in effect, became the areas of where we would say, well, the peripheral programs, let's diminish the resources there, and we'll just kind of lay the expectation onto the schools. And I don't know of a lot of teachers who are trained to be social workers or psychologists, but they end up doing that. And then at the same time, we kind of say to them, yeah, but on the other hand, you better teach these kids, you better give them a good score, and you better make sure. All of these constraints are there. And we have to figure this out, but we have to find a way in which we can complement the teachers and support them in how they do this. And it may sound like I'm pleading a lot on behalf of teachers, but that's just a stark reality. There's no other way around it. When we look at it in terms of these issues, en français, la pauvreté, poverty, limiter les attentes du public en matière d'éducation, santé mentale, autres besoins de l'élève, et les définitions étroites du succès. And that last one to me is something that I find fascinating, is the narrow definition of success. The narrow view of success. And one thing that I discovered as well in the reform in Quebec that we saw in the 2000s, which, by the way, just to mention to you that if other provinces, whether it be in Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, when you feel that you've got 21st century curriculum, that's fantastic, but in Quebec they did it and they started in 1999. It was slowly dismantled over about a 10-year period of time, but there were some remarkable things happening. But there was something that was very interesting in terms of the narrow definition of success. Was that as the K-12 reform, or in Quebec, K to secondary 5, grade 11 was happening, the one group that actually wasn't too crazy about the reform were the universities. Because the universities saw this as a direct threat and a change to the way that they had to function and operate. And so as a result, it caused problems. So as a key suggestion that I would say in other provinces, when you're embarking on this type of initiative, you have to make sure the universities are on board, particularly with respect to their entry requirements and their marks for the students to get in. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, what you see here then has been really a compendium of issues that have been brought forth by people who are here in terms of making sure that all they're trying to do in the classroom is as best of a good of a job as they can. And what is remarkable is that even if we use PISA and we use all these other scores, what has been remarkable is that in spite of all of these challenges, Canada, if we use this type of measure, does remarkably well.